everybody. Welcome back to the channel. Today's topic is going to be cultural anthropology. Cultural anthropology, of course, being one of the four major subfields of anthropology. So basically what cultural anthropologists do is that they study living people and they study the communities that those people are from. They study these people's lives, their experiences. They study different cultures, how cultures structure things like gender, politics, power, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, family, even how, these groups, these people engage in things like the global economy, how different, cultures around the world approach spirituality. What is their art like? What sort of things do they find aesthetically appealing rather, just to name a few things. Often, though, you'll hear cultural anthropologists referred to as ethnographers, and this is because they write what are called ethnographies. So these ethnographies, they're like very detailed, very thick descriptions of cultures. And by thick descriptions, I mean that they're like just chock full of detail, usually detail that like the casual observer would probably just not even notice. So, ethnography really is where the craft of the cultural anthropologist lies. And its success is really based on the skills that the ethnographer brings to the table. Writing ethnography really is kind of like an art form. So we use language in our ethnographies that really humanize the informants, that teach us all about their culture. In many cases, we might incorporate, personal narrative or even eyewitness accounts, even weaving in things like journalism and detective work as well. So we get this data, we get data about cultures for our ethnographies by doing what's called ethnographic fieldwork. And this usually does involve living and interacting with a community for a period of time. So while we're doing this, we make recordings, we note observations like all the time. We take photographs, we speak with people, we might work alongside of them, participate in the same activities that they are engaged in. It's really important for a cultural anthropologist to establish something called rapport. Rapport is like a trusting relationship. So we want to establish this rapport, this trusting relationship with informants so that we can get a deep understanding of people's lives. Informants, of course, are people who are knowledgeable about a culture. And we really can't do our work without them because they're the insider. They are a member of that culture who can tell us something about that culture's way of life. So cultural anthropologists, they actually typically live with a community for an extended period of time. This can be a couple weeks to a couple years. It's like the longer you stay, the more that you get to see, and the more authentic, interactions and cultural exchanges become. Now, doing fieldwork involves like these two perspectives. So we endeavor to begin from what's called an emic perspective. That's EMIC, the emic perspective. And this really means just understanding a culture on its own terms from an insider's perspective. So understanding how local people think, how they like visualize, how they conceptualize the world, and really seeing the world through that culture's lens, which is going to be different than the way I see the world or you see the world. Now, anthropologists also have a commitment to understanding the human experience and sharing that in our publications. And this is where another perspective enters the picture, or what we call the Edic perspective. That's ETIC, the Edic perspective. And the Edic involves understanding a culture from the anthropologist's perspective, from the outsider's perspective. And this really, this really provides a foundation for comparison. comparison with other relevant case studies. So a little example here, imagine you're an anthropologist who wants to learn about Spanish flamenco guitar. You'd first need to understand it from the perspective of a Spanish musician, from a flamenco guitarist. You'd want to understand how to hold the guitar, how to feel the groove of the guitar. You'd want to understand finger placement, language too, that's used to describe guitar anatomy. That would be the emic element, the emic perspective. Now, the anthropologist also needs to be able to describe this experience in a way that can make sense to their readers, to outsiders. So, in a way also that, is objective, in a way that's also, without ethnocentrism. So that really is the Edic voice. So anthropologists, we endeavor to integrate both of these perspectives into our field work and also into, the ethnographies that we write. Now, in my opinion, some of the most important skills that an ethnographer could have: patience, empathy is very big, neutrality, and also the ability to listen and be observant. I think, maybe one of cultural anthropology's main contributions to the social sciences is actually its toolkit and the perspectives that are fostered within the subfield. So the tools of the discipline really do help sharpen your ability to see the everyday, the mundane details of life, and the symbolism, the meaning behind these seemingly, routine acts. It's like when you're an anthropologist, everything becomes anthropological. And when you're in it long enough, it's almost like life itself becomes this kind of ethnographic encounter. At least that's my own personal experience. Now, what I'd like to do is go over a couple methods or a couple tools in an ethnographer's toolkit here to really give you a deeper sense of how they do their work. So participant observation really is one of the principal methods of cultural anthropology that they use in the field. And it involves observing and participating in the daily life of the people that they're studying. So, imagine, for example, that you want to cook a good, authentic Italian meal. You can learn all about it on YouTube. But think about the ways that your experience might be richer. How would it be more meaningful if you were to actually apprentice in the kitchen of a Sicilian nonna, of a grandma? The art of cooking really is as much about achieving proper aroma, proper feel, proper texture, proper taste at each step of the recipe. And this is something that could be a little difficult to capture by solely watching, a cooking demo on YouTube. So really participant observation involves this deep level of immersion into a culture. Now, another example, and I'm going to draw from some professional fieldwork research here. A cultural anthropologist whose work I really love, her name is Hilary Agro, and her field setting is actually rave culture in Toronto, Canada. And what I thought I would actually do is read a little excerpt to you of her work right now so that you can get a bit of a sense of how deep some anthropologists choose to go with participant observation. So have a listen, try to remain neutral if you can. So I quote Agro here directly. She says, "As I became further involved in the Toronto dance music scene, the lines between interviews and participant observation became blurred, as tends to happen. Conversations begun in interviews would continue through friendships on a regular basis, and those who'd heard about my research would approach me at events and online to share their stories and thoughts. I immersed myself in the scene, participating in everything that ravers do: dancing, talking, sharing water and food, dressing in costume, and sometimes using mind-altering substances. The insights these methods gave me allowed me to develop rapport with other ravers and to understand the complexities of rave culture in its actual context, something which is difficult to capture through interviews alone. Both dancing and the use of consciousness expanding substances are practices which are very centered on the physical, the direct, unmediated bodily experience in the world. To study a physical practice without ever experiencing it hinders understanding to a degree that at best easily misconstrues the phenomenon and at worst can be downright harmful. As one of my participants pointed out, and I quote the participant here directly through her work, participant says, quote, "A million descriptions of an acid trip can't come close to what it will tell you." So, what Agro is doing here is participant observation, you guys. She's not only observing, but she's also participating really in all aspects of rave culture. Again, from wearing traditional clothing to even having the psychedelic experiences. Now, some critics of her work, they've actually argued that we lose our sense of objectivity and professionalism by engaging in things like mind-altering substances. There's no really like right or wrong answer here, but I bring up the case because it's interesting. And it kind of makes the point that participant observation in an orthodox sense does involve complete and deep immersion. Ultimately, the bottom line is, it's up to the ethnographer to decide on their degree of immersion, based on safety, based on their comfort level. Now, I want to pivot the conversation to some of the writing styles that we use in ethnography. Virtually all ethnographies use what's called thick description. Again, that's a very rich level of detail. So, taking good notes, paying attention to the context of behaviors, paying attention to things like textures and colors in a landscape, even noting how somebody's, tone or pitch of voice fluctuates when you hit a really sensitive topic. So this idea of thick description, it essentially involves this very like keen level of awareness while you're doing field work. I want to talk to you a little bit about the work of one of my favorite cultural anthropologists. Her name is Sienna Craig. And she's famous for a lot of reasons, but she wrote this really cool piece called Portrait of a Himalayan Healer. She's a medical anthropologist, and a lot of her fieldwork has been centered in Nepal and Tibet, and her work looks at the healing arts there. And in this piece that I'm talking about, she writes about this ethnographic encounter that she has with Tibetan amchis. Amchis are essentially healers. Her ethnography is actually full of incredible detail and context, and I just want to cherry pick a couple lines to read to you so that you kind of get an idea of what we mean. So she says in one section, quote, "Books are tea-stained and once or twice soaked through by rain." It's very descriptive. In another piece, she says, "Religious texts are wrapped in cloth." In another part, she says, "Rivulets of tears trickle down his dusty cheeks." She also remarks how the Amchi wrapped medicine in, quote, "pages torn from an old student notebook." So again, it's like to capture this level of detail and context, it does require exquisite observation of the mundane. So, we can only just infer from this that, she must have taken careful notes while she was in the field. She also makes her encounters intimate, and her thick descriptions are really poetic. And I'll just cherry pick a couple quick lines here so you kind of can appreciate her prose, if you will. So she says, quote, "Two generations of this family's women perform chores as if seamlessly playing a symphony." Another line, "Her eldest niece carves a slab of butter from a block with the swiftness of a potter slicing clay." And another line that I really like, Gyatso pins down her forearm as Tenzin inserts the needle past layers of weathered mountain skin into the river of bluish vein. So what Sienna Craig really is doing here is she's bringing in really clever literary devices, imagery, metaphor, simile into her ethnographic writing. And that is one of the important things about ethnography. That's what makes an ethnography compelling. Moving on to something else that's important with ethnography, a lot of cultural anthropologists today, they adopt something called a reflexive tone. This is pretty key. Reflexivity refers to the anthropologist's awareness of their own identity and how that can affect their fieldwork, their analysis, how they see the world. So really it's about being upfront about who you are, your identity, your personhood, and how that can influence the data that you get and the experiences that you have as an anthropologist. So this is pretty critical. Ruth Benedict actually says that not everybody sees the world through the same lens, and this affects the interpretations that we do make about other cultures. I've used reflexivity in my own writing, and it is a tool that I really do like a lot. A couple years ago, I actually did write a piece about how archaeology can empower women. And archaeology, like many academic disciplines, actually has been historically androcentric. So I kind of talk about how I was intellectually raised by literally all men archaeologists, and how all the literature that I was assigned to read as a young archaeology student was also written by men. I actually came to a point in my career where I was like, oh, wait a second, this is interesting. I'm seeing this pattern here. I never had a woman archaeologist as a mentor or role model. So, I kind of got into looking into the lives of early women archaeologists that were silenced by history. And it was through history books that I found some real trailblazers, some heroines that really empowered me. The unfortunate thing is that they were all dead. They were all long gone. So in my piece, I raise, the question of how my experience as a student, as a young anthropologist, you know, probably would have been pretty different if I developed mentorships with great women in the profession and read more about, women's perspectives on archaeology. So this really is reflexivity, reflecting upon oneself and how your experience shapes how you see the world and how you interpret it. The other piece that I think I want to bring in here is how doing field work actually changes you. It will change the anthropologist. It's like you'll never be the same, usually for the better. There's an anthropologist, George Melch. He's very famous. One of his interesting pieces that I really like is called Lessons from the Field. And it's actually about the ethnographic encounters that his undergrad students have during their first fieldwork experience in Barbados. So it's interesting because you have Melch here who's doing an ethnography of his students who are enrolled in a study abroad fieldwork course. And what I always find striking here are the changes that his students experienced, during fieldwork and kind of after they came home. So his young students realized things like how fast-paced American society is. They kind of woke up to how a lot of Americans create diversions from stillness and solitude. There are always these distractions in American culture. A lot of his students who were white, they remarked how this was their first experience actually being a racial minority. And a lot of his students also remarked that when they came home, they were almost shocked by how many things they had in their house, by how many possessions they actually own. So it's like they became acutely aware of how materialistic American society is when they were doing their field work. A lot of other anthropologists have reflected on this point too. Jason De Leon, who I talk about in another video, his work again is about humanizing migrants who cross the border. And during his field work, he would actually come across human remains in the desert. And he referred to the job of determining a woman's cause of death. And I quote him here as a kind of, quote, moment when you despise the capacity of the human imagination. Another famous anthropologist, cultural anthropologist, Nancy Shepherd Hughes, she has written a lot of famous pieces. This one piece that I'm thinking of is called Mining the Body. And it's actually about gangs who abduct people for the human organ black market. And her piece opens with this sobering line. She says, quote, "For many years, I've been documenting the violence of everyday life." So her work is about essentially death and violence. She's made a career out of it. Another anthropologist, Edie Turner, she's remarked in her work almost how unreal Western life looks after having been immersed in the so-called traditional culture. So it's like, can you imagine how you would react after having maybe similar experiences of some of these cultural anthropologists? So it's like, what happens in the field, my light just turned off, but we'll keep rolling. What happens in the field does affect the anthropologist and how we process that in our writing. And I'll even add how we process that with our, emotional health can be a little challenging to square with. Anthropologists, we might be scientists, kind of societies, of cultures, but we're not robots. No matter how many times we go in the field, we never, I think, really develop immunity or armor to the, sometimes harrowing experiences that we can bear witness to. It's like we never really return the same. One other thing that I think is pretty key to touch on before we move on to another segment of the talk is ethics. This is a pretty important part of doing field work, really in any of anthropology's subfields, but it's a good place to talk about it here with cultural anthropology. There are ethical standards that we do need to hold ourselves to, professional ones. We never ever do anything at the expense of the people that we study. We must obtain something called informed consent from the communities, from the people that we're working with, meaning we have to ask their permission. We don't just roll up and start, taking notes and writing up our ethnography. We have to kind of bring them in and say, this is, I'm an anthropologist. Here are my credentials. I'm interested in studying for X, Y, and Z reasons. What do you think? Do I have permission? We ask them if they want to be involved in our work. We invite them into the process, but we only proceed we only proceed with their consent. A lot of times we do use pseudonyms, so fake names for people and for their communities. And we do this to protect informants, and we do it to protect, their homes, their communities. The AAA, the American Anthropological Association, really does have extensive standards published on their website that offer like more additional guidelines for navigating these things. But the golden rule, as I say, the bottom line here with ethics and anthropology is to do no harm, to not compromise the safety of the people that we're studying. So, I think we've covered a lot so far. We've talked about what cultural anthropology is, how they do their field work, how they write, and the ethical standards that they're held to. The last thing I think I want to do is show you how we make sense of a component of culture. So, to really give you a sense of this subfield of cultural anthropology, I want to take one topic that we work with pretty often here. It's going to be the topic of gender, and I want to deconstruct it for you like a cultural anthropologist would. And I'll also share a little bit about my own research here and my own personal experience. So, a little history here. Anthropologists really began to engage with the topic of gender in the mid 20th century. The women's movement that took off at this time was centered on equal rights, on equal pay. Social thought was a little rocked by this, what we call this second wave feminism. And the movement really prompted scholars across so many different disciplines, especially anthropology, to examine the global diversity of gender politics. Now, in the social sciences, we distinguish between the word sex and gender. Sex referring to the physical, the biological differences between males and females. Gender is different. Gender is a word that we use to refer to the kinds of expected behaviors that cultures assign to different sexes. So, again, in other words, sex is biological. Gender is something that is cultural, it's something that's culturally prescribed. Just how race is, just how ethnicity is. Anthropologists see gender as something that's constructed, something that's made by cultures. It's something that's taught to people of a culture, and it's something that, members of a culture learn. So I'll ask you to think about some examples. Is there a stereotypical style of dress that's expected of men and women? How do we know what is considered appropriate dress for men and women in society? An anthropologist would say that culture assigns all of this information. TV, internet advertisements, billboards, mannequins in retail locations, all of these kinds of things actually play significant roles in regulating styles of dress for men and women. Although maybe we're not super conscious to it, it is actually functioning on some level. So it might actually be really interesting to see if you can decode any messages about gender that could be hidden in the next advertisement that you come across, whether it be an Instagram ad, something that pops up on YouTube, or if you're watching Netflix or whatever. Pay attention to the ads and see if there are any gendered messages that you feel like are being sent to the viewer. One of the big overarching themes, though, that I think comes out of anthropology in general, especially cultural anthropology, is the idea that cultures change, of culture change. Cultures never remain the same, they're always in flux. So in recent years, society has, really begun to relax the idea of dressing for your gender. Chest binder sales are up. They're even being sold by, mainstream corporate retailers like Walmart, Target. Of course, speaking to the growing community of people who are embracing this non-binary identity. Another example, very common for women to wear jeans today. 2 or 3 generations ago, absolutely not. And even skinny jeans. Skinny jeans were originally rolled out as a women's clothing trend some years ago, but they've become like super popular among young hipster type men. We could talk about bras. Bras at one time were a socially mandatory piece of clothing for women to regulate natural curves of the body. And it's like today, it almost seems like they're becoming invalidated. Now, I love talking about Emily Martin's piece. It's called The Egg and the Sperm. Love to talk about it when we treat the topic of gender. So let me share a little bit about her work. So essentially, what she does is that she tries to show how gender stereotypes go beyond things like clothing, extending to the way that biologists talk about reproductive actions that are performed by egg and sperm. So her data set is actually really interesting. Her data set, it's actually biology textbooks, specifically ones that were assigned to medical students in the 1980s. And she views these texts as a reflection of society's stereotypes of men and women. So let me just cherry pick a little bit of her language so you get a sense of what I mean. So the books that she draws from, they kind of speak about sperm as being, quote, remarkable and amazing. They explain that sperm's, quote, sheer magnitude and, quote, size, is so big, and even remarks on the size of different, parts of the seminiferous tubules and all these little things. So you can kind of get a sense of gendered language here. Female reproduction is explained a little bit differently, with a little bit less enthusiasm. So an egg is thought of as like passive, as this passive actor in the sense of reproduction, to be penetrated or to be harpooned by sperm, that sperm being on a mission. She talks about how books present ovaries becoming old and worn, resembling something that's scarred and battered. So it's interesting, really what the language in bio books reveal is how scientists have for so long envisioned sperm as the active party, and the egg is kind of like this damsel in distress. And this is all happening against an emergent backdrop of research that almost suggests the opposite, or suggests at least that the sperm and egg have at least equitable performance qualities. So her work is kind of interesting because it does show how the language of Western science really is not immune to cultural conventions of gender. So the cultural assignment of gender extends to how the West describes the biological process of reproduction. Now, anthropology also shows us that many cultures around the world allow for a lot of gender diversity rather than fixed either or categories that have characterized basically almost all of Western culture. Anthropologists really see gender more term of like a continuum of behaviors that range between masculine and feminine rather than like a set in stone either or. So, at this point in our talk, I hope that you got the sense that biology doesn't necessarily enable us to predict how a person will perform their gender. Transgender identity, is actually far more common cross culturally than most of us realize. As an example, most Native American tribes recognize a third gender, what they call a two-spirited individual who's actually believed to have special supernatural powers. They might even enjoy certain social privileges too. In India, hijras often take on women's roles, and they're usually revered as very powerful ritual figures in Hindu culture. Gender is also a point of contention for a lot of societies. Most cultures have mechanisms that enforce unequal access to things like power, prestige, rights, authority, and status based on gender alone. This is something that's called gender stratification, and it's almost a cultural universal. So you might want to consider, to what extent does this continue to occur in our own society today? Going back to Emily Martin's piece, though, it has me thinking a bit about almost the anthropology of professions. She's doing an anthropology of like of biology, if you will. But there are ethnographers who do an anthropology of anthropology, myself included. Before I talk to you a little bit more about my own work, let me just shout out a really interesting book that kind of does make sense to plug here. It is an ethnography. It's called Harassed, and it came out in 2019. It's really interesting. It's written by Rebecca Hansen and Patricia Richards. They really talk about the gendered experiences that ethnographers themselves encounter in the field. So it kind of does this really interesting job of exposing the silences around gender-based harassment in the field. And this is something that I would say, basically since the last 3 or 4 years, that anthropology is really like waking up to. Archaeology, and this is where my stuff comes in, archaeology is no exception. Archaeology has very much so been an androcentric field. And I might argue to the point, maybe a little more so than some of the other specialties, some of the other subfields in anthropology that we've talked about. I got smart about what I was experiencing when I was starting out as a very young anthropology student about 20 years ago. And I began to, over time see it more of like an ethnographic encounter, meaning I began to look at the field of archaeology, to look at what I was experiencing, what other women were experiencing with the eye of a cultural anthropologist. Now, there are actually a lot of similarities, or I should say, maybe were a lot of similarities between construction sites and archaeological sites. So, when I first started in archaeology about 20 years ago, all projects were still run by men, a lot of whom tolerated all of the things that go with stereotypical hard hat, lunch pail kind of culture. So the construct of masculinity really structured field crew culture in archaeology. When I was a student, to be an archaeologist meant to be very masculine. It was like real archaeologists were masculine, masculine men and masculine women. People who oriented more toward the feminine spectrum were actually ridiculed, very much so behind their backs, ridiculed for how they kind of, wore nail polish, makeup, more feminized field attire, to the point that I think in a lot of cases they were shamed by the group and almost perceived as like posers from their masculine counterparts. The innuendo humor, the machismo elements that, stereotypically you would find at construction projects, you'd find very similar things at archaeology projects, especially when I was first starting out. Again, this is a time when I was not in charge, when I was just on the crew. Crews were a fraternity. It was a fraternity-like culture. And it was like by 3 o'clock, the real ones convened at bars, swigging beers, sucking on cigarettes, and literally just congratulating each other for moving dirt so quickly at the site. Or, if that got boring, the conversation would switch to spilling tea about who slept with who the night before. So, yeah, there were gender obstacles in archaeology, and I talk quite a bit about this in my writing. As I was writing my dissertation, there were a lot of other gender obstacles I faced. So I faced them when I first started out, all the way through the dissertation process. My dissertation, the intention is that it was going to be all about pottery. But what became very interesting is like the undercurrent story. I kept getting denied access to a lot of collections, or if I did get access, in many cases, I had to deal with people who tried to take advantage of me. And I kept telling my advisor, it's like, I wanted the data, I don't want the date. So, at this time was actually the start of the Me Too movement. So it was kind of serendipitous that all of this was happening. So ultimately, my dissertation grew into a piece that confronted toxic masculinity in archaeology at the beginning of the Me Too movement. And what I discovered is, how this creates inequalities that really disadvantage and exclude women and ultimately end up pushing women out of the field. So to my knowledge, I think my dissertation was actually probably the first serious, analysis of toxic masculinity, of gender-based harassment, of sexual harassment in the field of archaeology. Um, we've talked about reflexivity before and how one's positionality affects research and interpretation. And I think about my own, personhood, my own position here. Of course, as a woman, I've been socialized by society, by my family, probably like a lot of women who are watching right now, to be polite, to be gentle, to be nurturing, to be passive, to not be aggressive, because we want to avoid, being called rude and like that, pardon my French, but that nasty bitch stereotype. At the same time, these ideas for what a woman should be in mainstream American society, they did not serve me well to be an archaeologist and to write this dissertation. I had a hard time getting data as a woman archaeologist with these traits. It's like in some cases, maybe I wasn't pushy enough. In some cases, I wasn't aggressive enough, I guess. It's almost like I was enculturated to fail at this. This is something that I talk about, but that very point became the crux of my piece. Had I been a man, had I been less feminine, had I been more masculine, took on more masculine qualities perhaps too, I think the story that I was able to tell, for my dissertation probably would have been much different, without a doubt. My gender definitely shaped my access to data, definitely shaped how the dissertation ultimately came out. Um, Before we wrap up, I don't want, people to think that archaeology is this toxic, dumpster fire. It's not. Not anymore. When I entered archaeology, this was a generation ago. This was 20 years ago. People then told me that it had gotten so much better than it was when their generation was doing archaeology. So what I saw was probably some of the last lingering vestiges of old school archaeology. Things really have changed in the field. They are continuing to change. I am seeing a lot of women in management positions now, especially in the commercial sector, than ever before. Whereas, again, 20 years ago, when I was just starting out, 18, 20 years old, there were virtually none. There were virtually no women who made it to upper level management positions. And one kind of questions whether they were drummed out of the field before they had a chance, to get to that status. There's also been a lot of intense scholarly attention to unmasking gender and sexual harassment in archaeology, too. Archaeology really has gotten to a point where there is much less tolerance for what we call gender bullshit. So if you made it to this point, I am so grateful that you chose to tune in, that you chose to learn about cultural anthropology with me, again, as I see it, through my point of view, through my lens, and through my experiences. Please don't forget to hit the like button if this video helped you understand some of the essentials of cultural anthropology. And of course, you can subscribe to this channel, Anthropology and Alchemy, so that you don't miss any new uploads.